right, we are now streaming live on Facebook. So let's go ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I want to welcome all of you, including our participants, to this call, this conversation tonight that we're calling, Are We Doing Justice? I want to say welcome to everybody who may be new to Sanctuary. Perhaps this is one of your first times being a part of any sort of conversation within our church. My name is Edrin, and I serve as lead pastor here at the Sanctuary. And I want to thank you for joining us tonight for this conversation. For everybody who's watching, whether you're near or far, I want to pray and I hope that you and your loved ones are safe and healthy right now in the midst of COVID-19. And so just a reminder, we try to say this all the time, if there's any way our church can be helpful to you and your family, can come alongside you and help serve you in this season, we would love to be able to do that. So please don't hesitate to reach out to our church office. You can email us at hello@sanctuarycov.org, or you can connect with us on any of our social media pages or by going to our website, www.sanctuarycov.org. We'd love to help however we can. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight for this conversation that I hope will be encouraging, will be inspiring, also challenging, but helpful all around. To the question of why we're having this conversation, I want to share a little bit of my story as a way of backing into why we're doing this conversation tonight. If you've been around Sanctuary, like I said, over the last several years, you've certainly heard me share parts of my personal story. I grew up in South Carolina, there in the Low Country. And one of the ways that I describe where I grew up is that I'd say I grew up in the shadow of Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie, which were the places where the first shots of the Civil War were fired. And so that's the region, the area where I grew up. And so I'd say I grew up breathing that air of racial strife. And early on, even as a kid, became really, really aware of the fact that there are some real inequities in our world, some real inequalities that existed between people. And that reality shaped my worldview over the years. It really led me to pursuing education, studying US history and African American studies. It led me to pursuing degrees in biblical and theological studies. And a part of my soundtrack, the soundtrack of my life, is that song by the late, great Donny Hathaway, that someday we'll all be free. That's one of my favorite songs. It's a theme and a recurring theme within my life. And I can honestly say that I wake up every day with a clear sense that the work of the liberation of my people and all people is absolutely important to God. And so that's my a glimpse into my heart and my head. And tonight's conversation flows out of that reality. And so now I find myself here at 39 years old, pastoring this great church that we call Sanctuary Covenant Church, an urban, multi-ethnic church that's committed to seeing God's peace and shalom flourish in our community here in North Minneapolis, but also more broadly. And I carry with me what I've been describing over the last 2 weeks as a righteous anger over the ways in which Black and brown bodies continue to be devalued, and the ways in which there is injustice and violence against people who look like me, where that continues to be the norm. There's this constant shower of hashtags that I feel like we see in our world, and each hashtag represents a life that was taken way too soon. And rather than just accepting that that's the way the world is, I believe God calls us as a church and as a people to raise our voices and our efforts to fight against this. And so both our words and our actions, in my opinion, have to always communicate that we are joining with God in the work of bringing about God's justice. And so as we heard about the death of Ahmaud Arbery, and as that was followed by the wrongful death of Breonna Taylor, and then as we heard about Sean Lee, just recently, even last night, just learning more about his death, I wanted to gather some voices, some friends, I would even call them, from within our Sanctuary family, whose voices I respect, whose opinions I respect, and who have a positive track record of doing justice in our church and in their day-to-day lives. I wanted to pull some folks together just to reflect on what has happened, and also to help us think about what it means to not be stuck in the midst of the pain, but to be willing to sit in the pain for as long as we need to honor it and acknowledge it, but then to look with hope and find ways for us to move forward together, so that we won't continue to be inundated with hashtags, so that we can build a more just society, and that we can join the work that God is doing and making all things new. And so I'm joined by some friends here on the call. I just want to call out their names really quickly, and then I'm going to ask a question that gives them an opportunity to introduce themselves a little bit. I'm excited to have my sister Leah Fulton on the call with us tonight. I'm excited to be joined by Marcus Owens. I'm excited to be joined by one of our elders, Jenny Olson. I'm excited to be joined by my sister Nadine Graves. I'm excited to be joined by my partner in crime, Pastor Rosalie Norman. And again, my name is Edrin Williams, senior pastor here at the Sanctuary Covenant Church. Again, thank you all for joining us. And I want to jump right into the conversation. And I have some questions structured, but this truly is a conversation, and so it will go where the Spirit takes it. But as a way of introducing yourselves, I just want to maybe hear a little bit of how you describe who you are. Maybe describe your family if you would like to, and then help us to paint just a quick picture of what justice is to you. If there were a snapshot or an image that explains justice to you, what would that be? When I think about justice, I first think about shalom, this idea that's far more than just peace. I think about shalom as all things being perfectly as God intended them to be. And I see a part of the narrative of the scriptures is that God is working to restore all things to that place of shalom. And then I think about Dr. Cornel West, who says justice is love in public. How do you take this idea of shalom and then combine it with Cornel West saying justice is love in public? And so a part of my personal definition of justice is what it looks like when love puts on work clothes and walks out the door. Like, justice is more than just an ideal, and love is more than just a warm feeling. What does it look like for love to actually put on its work clothes, pick up its lunch pail, and head out the door and actually do the work of building a just world? And so I'm going to open that up to all of you. Who are you? Who are your people? And then what's a snapshot of justice for you? And if it's okay, Leah, can I ask you to go first?
Yes. I'm Leah Fulton, wife to Chris, mother to 3 little boys, and spend a lot of my time working in higher education, around questions and issues of diversity and justice and the role that education plays in that. When I think about what justice is, I think there's lots of different brands of justice, if you will. I tend to ascribe to biblical justice that I think is shaped by my motivations for the work and my posture in the work and my hopeful outcomes for the work. And so a dear friend said to me once, charity is pulling babies out of the water, but justice is going to the top of the stream and stopping people from putting the babies in the water to begin with. Yeah. So I think that probably captures how I think about justice.
Awesome. Thanks for being with us tonight. Yeah. Marcus, what about you, man? How do you think about justice, and who are you? Who are your people?
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me here with you tonight. Marcus Owens, and I like how you started this, Leah. So I'm the husband of Mariah Owens and the father to Jalen Carter and Adela. We've been going to Sanctuary now over 2 years, but I grew up in this neighborhood in North Minneapolis. I live a stone's throw away from where the riots took place in 1968, and have that history as being a 4th generation Northsider on how this community has gone up and down. And my work leads me to coming back to community, and over the last 5 years, thinking about how I can apply my skills, my experiences, my love for this community in a way that builds it up in a positive way, now with the African American Leadership Forum. Justice for me, and what keeps me going in this work is that one day I'm no longer feared because I'm a Black man. I don't have to worry about being perceived as a threat, and that the system actually works for me and it includes me in that process, meaning that if something happens to one of my community members, there's an arrest, there's charges, there's a trial, and that all looks the same no matter what color, gender, origin you came from, but justice is being served because we are here to protect all of our community members. So it's a interesting concept, justice, but it's something that I think that we can all achieve.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for joining us. Pastor Rose, why don't you jump in next?
Yeah. Well, so great to be with all of you this evening. My name is Pastor Rose. I serve in the area of formation at Sanctuary. Been at Sanctuary for 10 years now, and and I'm married to Ryan. We will celebrate 13 years next week, which is very exciting. We have 2 daughters, Esme and Isla. We live on the north side for 9 years now. For me, justice at its core is restoration. It's a surprising restoration because it may not always come about in the ways that we might expect it to, especially in a retributive system and space that we are so immersed in the United States. But for me, especially recently, I think that justice looks like collective action toward that restoration, that it's no longer a question of what action do I need to take, which is part of it, absolutely. But what action are we going to take? Because I think that's ultimately what the Bible calls us to.
Yeah, awesome. Nadine.
Thanks for having me. My name is Nadine Graves. I am a mom to Noah and Nicholas, 2 boys that you've probably seen run around a lot at Sanctuary. We've been going there, attending Sanctuary for the last 2 years, and just became members this spring. Professionally, I'm a public defender. I recently transitioned into a role where I represent parents who are subjected to child protection cases. Prior to that, I was a criminal defense attorney doing public defense work for Hennepin County. So, and my team was primarily representing people in Minneapolis. Also raised in the area, grew up in Brooklyn Park, spent a lot of my days and time in North Minneapolis because my best friend, cousin lives in North Minneapolis. And also attend church there and worked in a lot of community organizations in North. For me, justice is seeing that wrongs are righted. Essentially, I believe that we should all treat people how we want to be treated. And if through the justice system, as I see it, I try to make sure that those wrongs are made right. So even if that's holding officers accountable, that's holding my clients accountable, but yet still getting favorable outcomes, but not permanently barring them from society. I think that's how I see justice, as treating people how I would want to be treated, and that we would all model that same behavior.
Awesome. Last but not least, Elder Jenny.
Hey, it's good to be with you all. I was raised in Minneapolis, but spent about 25 years in Chicago. And so that is really where I cut my teeth in the whole whole racial reconciliation, racial righteousness. And so I came back about 9 years ago. I came back to Sanctuary about a month after Pastor Edrin started as youth pastor. So, but while in Chicago, did a lot of work with racial righteousness with the Covenant denomination. One of the co-authors with the original Invitation to Racial Righteousness curriculum, leading Sankofas, and so it's Ooh, as for this Edina girl, my education really was in Chicago. And I like, Pastor Edrin, your definition of it is your faith really going to work. Justice, in my mind, it is making things right, especially for people and systems and communities that have been oppressed by people and systems with power. And so how do I put my feet to my faith and make things right under those circumstances?
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. So again, thank you all for being here tonight. We're also joined by Tyler Dixon Ross, who's a member of our staff team. She's behind the scenes making all of this happen. So thank you, Tyler, for your work and making this happen as well. I didn't say it earlier, but I'm husband to Shaniqua and dad to Taylor and Harper, and they're waiting for me to get home so they can can jump all over me. And so enjoying this time here, but also looking forward to getting home and relieving mom in a little bit. So thanks for letting me be here, Shaniqua. I want to transition a little bit. Like I said earlier, part of what led to this conversation was the recent deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, a young man in Georgia, in Brunswick, Georgia, and then shortly after him, the death of Breonna Taylor, who was in her apartment asleep, and police came into the apartment under some questionable circumstances and ended up shooting her 8 times, and she died. I want to talk though first about Ahmaud's death, just because it's been everywhere for the last several weeks. And the specific question that I have for all of you, if you would just take a moment and answer this question. Have you seen the video of Ahmaud's death? And if so, what were your reactions? And if you have not seen the video, would you mind sharing why you chose not to watch? Personally, I have not yet seen the video, and I don't foresee myself watching it. I just to be completely honest, trying to lead a church our size through a pandemic right now and caring for a lot of people and hearing sort of carrying burdens and trying to walk alongside a lot of people through very difficult situations, trying to also make the adjustment at home to online schooling and that reality right now. When I heard about Ahmaud's death and that there was a video, I honestly, didn't think I had the mental and emotional bandwidth to see video of another Black man hunted down. And I'm intentional in using that language of being hunted because I think that's what would happen. I've spent a lot of time reading the reports, and even that is traumatizing in its own way, but I've chosen not to watch the video for those reasons. What about the rest of you? You can jump in as you can.
I have not, nor do I intend to see the video. I have a very visual mind. So sometimes I'm reading a book and I'll say, put it down and go, what channel was that movie on that I was watching? It's like, oh, it was the book I was reading, because I have visual reels in my mind. And the obsession that our society has with the consumption of Black death is problematic on a whole lot of levels. And so to be well, to be functional, and is not something that I want or need I don't have any functional reason to consume death in that way. And so I haven't and don't plan to.
Yeah. Marcus, can I come to you next?
There we go. Yeah, I agree with the sentiments there. I can't continue to watch these videos. One, it's just exploiting the death of an individual. This is a person. This isn't, entertainment, right? And I still have clear images of videos I have seen. So every time I hear that name, whether it's Philando or, it's the young man in Ohio or St. Louis or wherever the situation is placed, I see them in my mind, and that's a traumatic experience every time that keeps coming. So in order to be well, I don't watch those videos, and it allows me to maintain my focus on the work that needs to be done so this doesn't happen again. We know that it's going to continue to happen again. The question is how do we respond when it happens, and how are we changing ourselves and the system because it keeps happening, right? So watching it is detrimental in many ways because it opens up the debate on whether or not this was a hunting or whether this person was innocent or guilty, and that's irrelevant because the circumstances weren't such that anything to this degree should have happened. So, you know, folks saying that, well, they released the video in hopes to vindicate the suspects it's like, why did it take 2 months if, you know, this is what happened? Why does it take 2 days after you see the video to make any arrests in all these situations? It's because they don't value Black lives the way that we should, you know. And so it's difficult in these situations. You're glad that there's a video to be available so that police can do their job, but at the same time, it creates a whole another piece of trauma for our communities.
Yeah. Nadine, what about you? Did you see it?
Unfortunately, I did see it. I can't unsee it. I heard about it on the 5th. I didn't watch it until the next day because I had to mentally prepare myself for what I was going to see based on the accounts that a friend shared with me and some of the articles that I saw. In the nature of my work as a public defender, it's my job to see images like this. I see body cams, I read egregious police reports. And so I don't have the luxury to not see some of these things. Also, as being one of the only attorneys that a lot of people in my circle know, they often come to me to explain these situations to them. And so being able to, relay back to them, what my perspective is valuable to help people process the trauma that they're going through by seeing these things. My initial feelings was being triggered. I wrote a post about how I felt that in this country, we are told to get over and forget about slavery. We're told to forget about evils that have happened on this land. And yet, when these things keep happening, we talk about these things, it's almost like you see comments about, well, they shouldn't be calling it lynching because this isn't what happened, but it's of the same cloth. And so it's very exhausting. It's very frustrating, but I think it continues to light the flame to know that the work still needs to be done. But it is exhausting. It's tiring. It makes you afraid, especially me as a single mom with 2 boys. It alters how I want to parent my children. I don't allow my boys to play in the front yard. They have to play in the backyard now because I don't want nobody to assume something of them that they're not. And it's not crazy for me to think this because it has happened. There's a hashtag for Tamir Rice for a reason. And so this was just triggering. It was my knee-jerk response.
Yeah. Elder Jenny, did you get to see it?
Unintentionally, I was scrolling through some channels and it popped up. And as I was absorbing what I was watching, I closed my eyes when I heard the shots because I did not want to see it. I still have very vivid memories of watching the video of Laquan McDonald in Chicago, who was shot many times. It felt sacrilegious. I mean, it was a very clear feeling of we are watching evil. And I chose I don't want to bear witness to that. This was a holy moment in the sense of it's a life that was taken. And but I still hear the shots. I can tell you that, the video.
Yeah. What about you, Pastor Rose?
I chose not to watch it, and particularly for 2 reasons. I mean, like Jenny said, I mean, a killing, a murder like this is, the life of an image bearer lost. And it is deplorable, but it is at its core sin. And so I'm not going to watch wickedness like that, engage in consuming that kind of sin. And second, I've also made a conscious choice in the past years to truly believe and to listen to the accounts and the perspectives of Black people when such violence like this does occur. And so I don't need to watch something like that to know that it happened or to know that it happened in the way that it was described. Those accounts are valid, and so I don't have a reason to engage that.
Yeah. Yep, that's all helpful. Thank you. One of the words that several of you used was trauma and described events like this as traumatic. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about trauma. One speaker that I heard recently described trauma in a simple way, said trauma is a disturbing or distressing event that affects both the body and the brain. And so that was just a very simple, plain way of describing trauma. But there's also something called secondary trauma, where even if you're not the immediate, directly involved in the incident, there's trauma of hearing about it, bearing witness to it in video, trying to care for people who have been through traumatic experiences. You are traumatized yourself. There's also the idea of communal or collective trauma, where every time, one example would be in this case, when we heard about Ahmaud's death, it harkened back to all the other hashtags. And I can only imagine for older people in our community, decades of these stories, including some where they've never been able to process the evils that they saw in places, yes, in the South, but also in the Midwest here. How do we think about, how does trauma play into all of this? How is PTSD even involved in what we're experiencing in this? Can we talk a little bit about that? Like, where does trauma fit into all of this, and how does it play out? How does it impact you and others when things like this happen? Marcus, I'm wondering if you could jump in.
All right. So what I appreciate about where and what we're learning in community right now is that trauma plays a big part in all of our lives. And we're talking about experienced trauma, like you said, or distant or secondary trauma, whether it's from our ancestors or from family members, and it's embedded in our DNA. And I'm not, a clinician, so going into the technical terms of how this plays out, but just understanding that every time that we experience something in our lives, and it affects us differently. One of us has our own version of what impact trauma that can have. But for me, the trauma that I've experienced in particular as it relates to the death of Black bodies, right? I used to ignore it or just absorb it and not do anything with it. And thinking if I just either let the mind or the thought go away, then somehow I'm healing myself, or that I didn't need healing, right? But the longer that I've been in this work, the more I realized that I had to deal with it. And the moment I started to deal with it, it was compounded. It didn't disappear. It didn't dissipate. It was there, and I had to deal with it, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, it was, how do I dig in and start asking the questions about what is this doing to me and what can I do about it, right? And how do I heal? And for me, healing is around understanding where this idea of when and why white supremacy became a thing. Why did my ancestors become devalued or lesser than, and how it's then created the society we're in. And a couple of resources that I went to was a podcast. I'm a podcaster. I love podcasts, right?
Yeah.
So I looked at Seen on Radio, Seeing White. It's a 9-part series that just broke down how whiteness was even created. And it helped me understand the mentality in which, you know, white supremacy has been embedded in the fabric of this country, right? So understanding it and understanding what I'm up against helps me deal with the trauma, because then I know now this is a bigger thing than the individual that we're talking about. And then the second thing, and more recent, that I've read about is Malcolm Gladwell's new book, Talking to Strangers. And not realizing that even though we're all in the same country, we're all speaking relatively the same English, that we're all speaking different languages, and we all have different experiences and cultures that we come from that inform the way that we interact with each other. And that whole concept of feeling threatened because I can't read you, or the way that you looks different than the way that I look, and therefore I can't read whether you are a threat or not. So understanding these things helps me heal, but then also informs me and puts tools in my belt to be able to deal with what we're faced with when we have this trauma, so that it doesn't continue to compound on me.
Yeah. Marcus, you offered a couple resources, and we're going to keep a tab of those resources, and we'll share them with the viewers at the end of this call or over the next day or so. I really love to add two resources to that. One is Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands. And then another book that from one of his mentors called The Body Keeps Score, that really talks about the ways in which trauma shows up in our bodies, and it's not just us viewing it or experiencing it and then putting it behind us. Like it shows up in high blood pressure and hypertension and all those issues that many people just think come from bad health choices. Like some of that stuff is conditions that have been brought on to a people by stress and trauma, historical trauma, and passed down even genetically. And I would love to at some point just have a separate conversation just about that, because it really is so important for what we're seeing even in our community right now as to how COVID-19 is impacting Black and brown people. Some of it is because of those conditions that have been brought on by trauma and have not been dealt with.
Right.
I think
Leah, go ahead, Leah. Yep.
I think one of the things that's really important around what you're describing, Pastor Edrin, is that we oftentimes have a frame of mind that says, well, if we can just deal with economics, if people can have good paying jobs where they can access good health insurance, that'll take care of all of this stuff, and that'll deal with high blood pressure and all those kinds of things. But some of the higher education research deals with the fact that oftentimes economic success means having to traverse predominantly white spaces, and part of what comes with that is overworking nervous systems that end up putting people in the same having the same health risks, despite upward mobility, and sometimes can even contribute to untimely death. And so I think it's really important for us to recognize that economic justice is part of the paradigm, but it's not the whole paradigm. So we can't overly rely on economics to repair. Again, I don't want to, I think if our lived experiences around economics, hunger, health, and otherwise, like Jesus wouldn't have come, right? Like the incarnational reality of what happens in our bodies and our lived experiences are absolutely important, but they're not the whole paradigm. I think the other part of that is, as we think about trauma, we can't forget about the agency that our ancestors exercised. I find myself wanting to think about that because it's easy to find myself in an emotional hole if I don't step back and think about what I can learn from foremothers and other folks who've had to deal with this. So I think about my grandmother, who was the sharecropper, who was the eldest of 16 children, no multiples, in a sharecropping family in Tennessee. And she would reprimand my mother if she cooked Sunday dinner on Sunday. That needed to be prepared on Saturday. And as a kid, I thought she was legalistic. But as I've gotten older, I've come to recognize that as a Sabbath practice for her. She was a domestic. She took care of white folks' kids and reared 9 of her own. And cooking Sunday dinner on Saturday sometimes was the only way that she was going to find rest. And so I think as we think about things like trauma, I think it's important for Black and Brown folks for us to think about what we can learn around agency from our ancestors.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a huge part of this conversation. Just that realization that there are things available to us, practices, healing practices that we often, for one reason or another, haven't been passed down to this generation, or that we don't honor and respect. As you were talking, I thought about my grandmother, who I always thought was strange in the sense that she would always walk around humming. But there's a healing happening as we hum. Like there's the body is able to heal itself just by humming. And I shared with our team a while back that one practice that I've paid more attention to now that I didn't notice that I do all the time is like holding my 2 middle fingers like this. Like for some reason that's comforting when there's like anxiety inside. I don't know where that comes from. I don't know exactly the science behind it, but I know there's something comforting about doing that. And so I think agency is huge in this, Leah, being able to say, yes, these things are true. This trauma is real and it's impacting us. And you can't learn your way out of it. You can't buy your way out of it. But there are some practices that have been passed on to us from our ancestors that we should be learning and teaching our kids because they're dealing with their own stresses. Any other thoughts on trauma? We have a few other things to talk about, but any other thoughts on trauma from anybody? Anything they want to jump in and share?
The one thing I want to mention too is that some of the work that I've been working on the last 2 years is understanding culturally specific and trauma-informed mental health care, right? Yeah. And so as our community thinks about healing from trauma, it is okay to seek out, health care to deal with the mental and emotional toll your body takes. So it's not something that you should hide away from or be ashamed by seeing a therapist or talking to a community healer. Like there's people that God's put in your path for, that healing. So don't be afraid of that and seek it, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. 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 I wanna talk a little bit about the legal part of this conversation. And we have an attorney on with us. And so Nadine, I want to ask you from a legal perspective, when we see Ahmaud Arbery's death, and when we see Breonna Taylor's death, and when we see Sean Lee's death, and then we go back as far as we want to go, and we see all the many people who have been harmed in this way, but then we see often justice is not seen. There's acquittals, sometimes there's not even charges brought. How is it possible that our legal system doesn't keep these things from happening? Like maybe technically, how does this stuff play out so that it continues to happen?
Well, it's twofold. It depends on who is the perpetrator, who did the killing. If it's an officer-involved shooting, officers are working as actors of the state. And so as agents of the state, they have some qualified immunity is the term, that if they cause a death, if they cause an injury, and they're doing this while doing their job, as long as they don't violate some blatant, egregious law in the process of doing it, they can get away with it. So, for example, there's so many, in Philando Castile's case here, it was so blatant, that's why he was able to go to trial and charges were brought, and that was also based on the discretion of the prosecutor. And so if you have prosecutors who are not willing to bring charges, like in the Ahmaud Arbery's case for 2 months. That's left with an elected official that's making that call, that's saying, nope, this person is justified and this person isn't justified. In Ahmaud's case, we saw this video, and but for our outcry, I don't think charges were going to be brought. But now that they have been, I think in ordinary terms in Georgia, I don't practice there, I'm licensed in Minnesota, but in Georgia, they're required to have a grand jury. For a grand jury to convene, it's roughly 16 to 23 people that come out, and they look over the evidence that the prosecutor presents. In Ahmaud's case, the initial prosecutor felt that after he reviewed that evidence, there was not enough evidence there to charge these individuals with a crime. As we see, it's very blatant that a crime has been committed here. These individuals were not working as police officers, they were civilians exercising what this prosecutor calls a citizen's arrest. A citizen's arrest is essentially where any one of us, it's legal here in the state of Minnesota, if we see a crime, we can detain a person, we can stop that person and hold them until the police come. In Georgia, if it's a felony, they're allowed to pursue that person. But in Ahmaud's case, we don't see him committing any felony. So they were not, in my opinion, not within their lawful rights to be able to pursue him and then extrajudicially execute him. As far as if there's I'm losing my train of thought. So yep, that we have legal actors, so the police officers, those cases are hard because they look at precedent. What has the Supreme Court says has happened in the past? And if this rose to the level of an egregious harm, then yes, they can be held accountable. If it doesn't match these set of facts that are that egregious, then they're justified in their actions. We've seen Rodney King. So if in Rodney King's case, if those officers were acquitted, and another officer down the line does the exact same thing, they're going to look at that case law and say, hey, these people were acquitted, so now you get to be acquitted. So until we have judges that are able to make those tough decisions and go against the precedent and set new law, that you have new people on the Supreme Court that are willing to overturn past case law, we're just going to continue to see the same things, unfortunately, and people not get justice.
Yeah. So you said one part of why this plays out the way we see it is because of who's the perpetrator. And I'm assuming the other part of it is who the victims are?
Absolutely. It's very clear that if the victim in the case is a white person, justice is served quicker. It's served differently. We see if the victim is a person of color that they're very slow to react. We won't hear about it. And so it's really unfortunate that it's so blatant, but yet the way the law protects these individuals, that's how we continue to see people not be held accountable and justice not being served.
Yeah. I want to ask a question for everybody, just a quick round robin, yes or no. And I also want to, for the folks who are watching at home, ask you to respond to this. Just enter it there in the chat or in the comments. The question is, do you expect a guilty verdict in either the Ahmaud Arbery case or the Breonna Taylor case? Do you expect a guilty verdict, that charges will be brought and that the actors will be found guilty? And maybe if you can, share why or why not. And so I'll just ask us here on the call, and again, would love to hear from folks at home as well. Do you expect a guilty verdict? And in either of those cases, and why or why not? So Pastor Rose, I'm going to ask you to go first. Do you expect a guilty verdict? Why or why not?
I mean, I would hope for one, but I don't have a high expectation that there'll be one. And very simply put, I mean, Nadine said it perfectly, of all the ways in which, I mean, the justice system is a system of power, and a huge system of power that is built on white supremacy in our country. And so I just don't see, especially the relationships that the two men in Georgia have with the people in power, it feels unlikely. Again, I want to hope, but it feels unlikely.
I'll jump in. I try to also remain hopeful. In this situation, as I said, these individuals were not police officers, but I also am forced to be reminded of George Zimmerman. He was also not a police officer. The difference is that we have a clear video here that shows them committing a heinous crime. They are arguing citizens arrest. I don't think it applies here. They are arguing self-defense. I think that's a hell of a reach. And so I remain hopeful. At the same time, I won't be surprised if justice isn't served.
I have very little expectation that either of them will see their murderers held responsible, because I think the historical context of our society, sometimes people talk about the system is broken. The system does what it was designed to do. And part of what it was designed to do is to dehumanize Black folks and people of color across the board. And so I have very little expectation that they'll be held responsible.
Marcus or Elder Jenny?
I'll let Jenny go first.
No, I don't expect there to be guilty. And if on the off chance they are, I'm going to be very surprised if they end up serving time, unfortunately. But like I said, been said before, I do hope that justice is done, but precedent says unlikely.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that it's going to happen. But what I would say that it feels like deja vu because of George Zimmerman. And I think this is an opportunity for the system to show that it's willing to bend towards, justice, right? And if it doesn't, then we're still where we're at and we know where we're at, which that keeps my expectations where they're at. But if it somehow bends towards justice, that gives me more hope that, we're on a path where it's still not perfect. And I don't think perfection is the goal, but at least, our voices were heard, all the brothers and sisters down in Georgia raising their voice to bring this to a jury or a grand jury was big. I don't think this happens 5 years ago.
Yeah. Yep.
In regards to Breonna,
go ahead. Yep. Go ahead.
In regards to Breonna, I think there's things that need to call into question the warrant that they used. They were able to use a no-knock warrant. In order to get a no-knock warrant, they have to have a judge sign off and say that this house that they were going to was one that officers were going to be in danger, would be placed in danger by going into this house, or the evidence that they were trying to seize could be destroyed in the limited time where officers needed to identify themselves. So until I could see that warrant and know what language was in there and what type of witnesses, those are the things that the attorneys representing Breonna's family are going to have to weed through in order for her to get justice. In her case, I'm a lot more hopeful based on that warrant. If there's false information, there's some accounts that I've read about the officer involved. It sounds like he's a shady character. And so hopefully those things can be used to help bring justice for Breonna.
Yeah. I personally, I'm very torn because the rational part of me is saying charges won't be brought. That a guilty verdict won't be had. But that's not necessarily a loss. Because I've been doing this for so long and have seen so many of these things, I still feel like even if a guilty verdict is not had, such as in the case of Trayvon and Mike Brown, there's still a huge amount of good that can come out of the display, like the obvious display of how broken the system is. And if while I never want to have these situations happen, but if it takes something like this to shake some of us out of our sleep, to actually see that things aren't just going to get better on their own. Like it will take the active work of a large collaboration of people. I even think it's particularly important for a place like Sanctuary to say this work is so big, it won't just get done by any one group of people. We need this large multi-ethnic movement to because there are some spaces that I'll be effective in speaking in and others where I don't have any sort of rapport, and it will need a voice like Pastor Rose. And there are others where Pastor Rose won't be effective and it needs Leah's voice or others, and we can think about our congregation. Honestly, I think that was a part of the wisdom of what Pastor Ephraim envisioned when he called Sanctuary to be, that this work is too big for any one group of people. And we need to in moments like this, think about how we broadly impact society and perhaps even a non-guilty verdict in this place might be a spark that over time can move us to a place where these things happen less frequently. And I could be being naive there, but that's essentially where I am. I'm not just waiting on guilty verdicts anymore, because I just think precedent says that it's not gonna happen. I want to transition a little bit as we think about Sanctuary as a church and as a movement. The Christian faith, like it's not a like an innocent bystander in these conversations. When we think about racial injustice and think about American history, there's a very strange relationship between the church and this evil that we're talking about, white supremacy and this race-based hierarchy. There are a number of examples of communities like North Minneapolis where when you talk to people about issues of faith and about the gospel, you're working from a deficit, because they have in their mind, from experience and from things that have been passed down to them, that the church is on one hand actively working against the well-being of Black and brown people, or on the other hand, the church is totally silent on these issues, and have nothing worthwhile, nothing worth listening to. And so we're either seen as impotent or we're seen as a part of the problem. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Christian faith and how we fit into this thing. There are some examples also, even in the case of Ahmaud, there's a large and growing Facebook group that's been created in support of the two men who killed him. And they're described as good, God-fearing men who were doing what they were called to do. And this is some attack from the enemy in the leftist media and all that kind of stuff. You also look at the political landscape and look at the ways in which in 2015, 2016, how evangelical Christians in many ways turn their back on the most vulnerable people in this nation in electing this current president. How do people trust the Christian faith? Like how can we expect people to look past those things and just see the good 3-point gospel that we're talking about? So I threw a lot out there. Like, can we talk about what Leah has called theological racism and just this big problem that we have?
I think it's really important for us to do a lot of reckoning with our history. We have times where, around history where people are saying never forget, and then you have the legacy for Black folks of people saying get over it. And it's like, what happened to never forget? When it's 9/11, we can never forget. When it's Holocaust, we can never forget. When it's slavery, transatlantic slave trade, and genocide, and the seizing of land from indigenous people, we need to get over it and stop talking. And so I think it's really important to understand that what led to lots of the foundation for what we see is theological racism. Kendi Ibrahim's book, Stand from the Beginning, really deals with some of those foundations. So he deals with issues of monogenesis and polygenesis, that talks about how some folks suggested that there were multiple Adams and Eves, and that the ones we read about in the Bible are who white people come from, and people of color come from other Adams and Eves who were subhuman. How you have climate theorists, some of our well-known and beloved philosophers throughout history who upheld these ideas that something was wrong with the brains of people who lived too close to the equator, and if we could be removed from there, our minds could become more rational, our skin could become more light. And then you have ideas like the curse of Ham, that Black people were destined to be ruled, and that it was white folks' God-given responsibility to take care of us. And you see that kind of rhetoric even into slavery. And so issues of theological and biological racism have laid the foundation for what we have, that has led to legislation. And the fact is, we continue to see those threats that we are animalistic, that we are beasts, that we are subhuman, that white people need to take care of us, that we can't make good decisions for ourselves. All of those things continue to be at work, and the church is right in the middle of it. Now, I think we also, in the spirit of agency, have to keep in mind the ways that we resist it. So you think about things like brush harbors, where Black folks would go into brushed areas that would dampen sounds and hang up cloths and use pots and turn them upside down that would absorb sound, and would worship in there, and would be able to engage with Jesus beyond the whitewashed Jesus that masters gave to them. And so
teach us, Leah, teach us.
But so when we talk about these, there were people like Nat Turner who were allowed to be literate, who were taught particular kinds of theology, who were used to try and control other slaves to obey their masters. But then whose minds were radicalized. And I'm not suggesting that revolts and killing people as the answer, like what Nat Turner did, but I do think there are people who use that, who were not identified by masters to teach, who in these hush harbors taught people what it really meant to follow Jesus, and gave them the breadth of scripture, and believed in justice. And so I think that those kinds of things are really important for us to remember. The ways that the church has both been implicit and has resisted. And those things oftentimes have happened even in single church spaces. And I think we have to be honest about the ways that the church has been part of that, and be thoughtful about how we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, anybody else want to jump in? How does our faith fit into this? Where does our faith fit into this?
Well, I would say, Pastor Edrin, when you said at the end of your comment or your question, about our 3-point gospel, and I think that right there is it. Like, we have gotten the gospel wrong. We have white Christianity has gotten the gospel wrong. It's gotten Jesus wrong. It's gotten this whole biblical picture wrong, and it keeps perpetuating it. And I think that obviously everything that Leah said is, I don't need to repeat any of it because she said it perfectly. What I would say that we're seeing in more recent history is that we as white people have individualized our faith so much that it's become no longer collective, and that when that starts to happen, you can see the ways in which, it starts as something as simple as, this personal salvation, which is wonderful, but then it forgets a collective call. And when you do that, you start to forget about the call, our mission to our neighbor. And when we forget that, we go into this like sinful forgetfulness when we need to have this like holy remembering. We have forgotten, just like Leah shared, this whitewashing of Jesus. We've forgotten that the historical Jesus was brown. He was a Palestinian Jew. He was poor. He was marginalized by the Roman Empire. He was eventually executed by that power because he posed a threat to that structure. And when we forget about that, again, we detach his message, we detach his mission, and we forget that because of who that historical Jesus was and still is, that we forget his solidarity that he shares with the oppressed, and we forget their place in the kingdom then as a result. I think that's the greatest tragedy to the authenticity of the gospel, is that because even with injustice, like, it's, yes, a restoration for sure, it's an equality, but it actually positions the disenfranchised above those in power, and we forget that when we individualize our faith.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. This whole idea of individualism, that we as a country have morphed our I guess our political belief as an individual agent and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and all these different narratives has now bled into our faith, and that it's all about me. As long as I believe in God, as long as I believe he died for me, I'm good. I show up to church a couple times, give a couple hallelujahs, I'm straight. I don't need to be a part of the body, right? But what does our faith require of us? If we're going to be part of a body, that means we're all a part of the body. We're not individual pieces that are just in a tool shed somewhere, but it's actually us coming together to play our role. And I see there was a question on there that was regarding to like the church's role for advocating for political reform. I mean, we all have unique gifts and skills. I mean, we have attorneys, we have pastors, we have people in higher ed, we have people that are doing community work just on this call right now. And it's like, we have a role because each of us has the skill to actually make change in our communities, and church isn't separate from community and togetherness. So how do we bring what we have to offer to the table so that it isn't about the building, but it's about the body and who we are as brothers and sisters in Christ, right? And that's, I keep struggling at my evolution with my Christian faith, that it's like, I thought this was supposed to be a body. I signed up for the party where all of us were going to get together and we were going to bring what we have to this collective, and it was going to be super awesome, because then I would only have to play my part instead of trying to play all the parts, right? It's like, if we get back to that basic level of understanding of how to live as Christians, and we put aside the salvation part, as Pastor Rose said, and think about like, well, what am I here to do? What am I here to give? What am I here to offer? That changes everything. And now we actually play a major role, and don't allow others that are claiming our faith to muddy the waters of what's righteous and what's just in our society. I mean, that's the part that frustrates me most, because, there's some that claim to be good Christians and all these wonderful things that say this is what the narrative is of being a Christian in this country. And then some of us think that, well, it's so complex, we shouldn't say anything. We should just stay silent and then allow that narrative to like overcome what we know, what we believe in our heart, and what's been given to us as a gift of voice. So, whew.
Yeah. Elder Jenny, Nadine, any thoughts around the faith aspect of this?
Yeah, I think, man, Marcus, what you just said, my mind's spinning. So often, my white brothers and sisters from the evangelical church, and that's how I was raised, it is, we stay out of politics unless it's just a couple of, key things. But, otherwise, nope, church, politics and church should be separate. And it's like, you cannot be silent. If there is injustice, how do we appropriately use our influence and power and move? Because otherwise it's this my personal holiness that I've seen, that it's my quiet time. It is my Bible study, my small group. But that's a place of privilege, right? because my world does not need anything else. I'm pretty self-sufficient. And so everything, even in my spiritual life, is based around my comfort versus what about public justice? How do I live this faith out? How do I use the influence and power that I have for good? How do I make things right? How do I, like Pastor Edrin, how do I roll up my sleeves that you said, and go to work, justice, go to work? And I think as Christians, often we forget the verse in Galatians that said, I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, it is Christ who lives in me. And we're so much about our personal rights and our comfort. And how do we say those have been crucified? And so I need to work for the good of my brothers and sisters, and sacrifice for them. Even to the point of my own discomfort. So
yeah. I keep going back to this. Leah's placed something in my mind and my spirit that I'm going to keep bringing up, and it's this idea of agency, that even as we point out all the brokenness, we're not like left without examples of how people have overcome the brokenness. Like there are very real and tangible examples of people who some might argue had it a lot worse than we do at the moment, but who chose not to just simply accept it. They resisted in every single way they could. One specific thing I'm thinking about just is the example that we have of the Black church. And while Sanctuary is a multi-ethnic church, if you've spent 3 seconds with Pastor Ephraim, he's a product of the Black church, and he brought the best of what he experienced and learned in the Black church and put that in the foundation of forming Sanctuary. And so I think there is something that we can learn and should be learning from the Black church around how, from a Christ-centered perspective, we can do more than simply accept that this is the way the world is. I think about the fact that historically the Black church has been more than a place for Sunday worship. It has been the center of Black life in this country, especially at times when we weren't allowed to be anywhere else. We couldn't go to the fitness club and the health club, and we couldn't get into the best universities. And so our Black churches, beyond attending to our spiritual lives, also created other institutions that would attend to the wholeness of who we were as people. And so when you think about our historically Black colleges and universities, many of them came to be because of the work of the Black church. When you think about the church became a place, I don't know how many of you saw the message yesterday from Trinity United Church of Christ that Reverend Otis Moss III gave. That was one part sermon, one part history lesson, one part cultural celebration. It has never just been about let me believe these things and just sit here until Jesus comes to snatch me up. Like that has never been how most people of color who follow Jesus have seen their faith. And I think we need to remember that in this season and in seasons to come. And it should shape and transform how we do discipleship at Sanctuary and other churches like Sanctuary. The last thing I'll say about this faith aspect of it is this. A friend of mine who works in campus ministry recently shared in a conversation very similar to this, that it goes back to what Pastor Rose shared, that she thinks we got the gospel wrong. There is core to the idea of the gospel. You see this all throughout the New Testament, especially in the letters as the communities of faith were being formed, that to follow Jesus often meant you came as you were, but you were grafted into this whole new community that was made up of people that otherwise were seen as enemies, like people who according to the wisdom of the day should never be in community with one another, were brought into community through the work and the gospel, the work of Jesus and the gospel. But it didn't happen in a way where they had to ignore who they were culturally to be accepted. And practically, here's what this often looks like today in evangelicalism, that for a person like me, I'm told I need to leave my culture behind and almost essentially adopt whiteness as a culture. And that's a part of me becoming a good Christian. And I think Sanctuary has a wonderful opportunity to push back against that, to say, yes, we are called together under the lordship of Jesus into this new community, but you don't have to whitewash yourself to actually be a good Christian. In fact, there's a beauty that you bring in the story of your people that makes our community richer, and how we figure that out and live that out together is the beauty of a community like Sanctuary. What are your thoughts around that? Like, am I off? Am I missing something? Like,
I mean, I think scripture tells us that when we look at Revelation and it's talking about the riches and the wealth from the nations being paraded in heaven. I think that's part of what we see there. I think there's the opportunity to learn from brothers and sisters and siblings of the East. What does it mean to follow Jesus? Because oftentimes we see this East-West binary of West being good and Eastern being dark and spooky and scary and sacrilegious, but Jesus was Eastern. And so I think there are some real opportunities to explore that. You know, the thing that I often point to is Revelation saying that every tribe, tongue, and nation, that he looked and he saw. And so the question I ask is, how do we know what tribe people are from, what nation people are from, what language they speak? By the ways people look and the way they sound. And if God sees fit to give us that glimpse of heaven and to preserve those things, then who are we to dismiss them now when we've been called to pursue God's vision for earth, or God's vision for heaven on earth? Then we have a responsibility to pursue a vision where people gather and bring their whole selves, because that is what honors God. And it's more than just an aesthetic, and it's more than just a song in another language. It has to be much deeper than that. But I believe that that is God's vision and call for the church.
absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. I want to sort of point us towards home and talk about having discussed all the things we've talked about tonight, that question that Dr. King asked in his last book that he wrote before he passed away: where do we go from here? What is the work before us? Because we could just sort of create a rhythm of coming together and having these kind of conversations, and then just go back to the way we were and not actually change anything about what we're doing. But what is the way forward? What is the work to be done now? How do we think about some meaningful steps forward, some solutions to the broad problems that we've talked about tonight? How do we find hope despite all the things that we see happening around us? Any thoughts there? And Elder Jenny, I would ask maybe if you would jump in first. Any thoughts?
Yeah. I I think it's easy, if I could speak for my people, to if I could, say sometimes it's, if I'm go to sanctuary, so isn't that enough? And to say, nope, not enough. What steps are you taking? There are all sorts of opportunities, both in our church and in our denomination, to stretch. So often we can look at issues of race and justice in our heads, and then we can walk away from them when we start feeling uncomfortable. It's like, that didn't feel right. I feel awkward. I'm going to step out of this conversation. That's privilege. To say, what do I need to do to move this conversation from my head to my heart, where it affects my soul, my whole being. And so to begin to say, what do I need to be in a white fragility small group? Do I need to go on Sankofa? Do I need to pursue a mentor who is of a different race or ethnicity than myself, so I can be taught by the wisdom of somebody else? How do I put myself in a position of learning, of being uncomfortable and not refusing to step away when I feel uncomfortable, when I feel pain, when I feel misunderstood, and to sit in that and have the stance of a learner. And yeah, I probably should stop there on my soapbox.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yet to lean into this hard.
Yeah. Pastor Rose, when you think about, I think one of the things that gets me excited is to know that you've been on your own journey of figuring out what does this mean beyond like just a verbal, we're a multi-ethnic justice-seeking church. Like, what does it actually mean to disciple, particularly white brothers and sisters who choose to be a part of a place like Sanctuary? What does that discipleship journey look like? Can you talk a little bit about what you call white followership and how we move forward? What does that look like? What does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do agree. I think it's so important that we understand what it means to be an urban multi-ethnic church and not just because it's trendy. I think it's imperative that we understand the story of our church at Sanctuary in the context of Sanctuary within North Minneapolis and what they both mean for our work toward racial reconciliation, how they inform our work of reconciliation. Because I often hear from our congregation that we are very unique, that Sanctuary, there's no place like Sanctuary. We're so unique in all these ways, which is true for sure, but we're actually part of a larger movement in the early aughts of multi-ethnic church plants that happened for this particular purpose of bringing about justice. And we're a part of that. But at Sanctuary, we're actually really unique within that movement because 70% of those multi-ethnic churches were started and led by white pastors. And ours is different. And I think it's important that we continue to name that we were specifically planted, yes, as a multi-ethnic church, but as a Black-led, Black-centered urban multi-ethnic church. And you'll see that if you read Ephraim's his opening kind of statement and of our church, it says that explicitly. He even said we won't be apologetic about it. And so I think we have to continually name that. And it's a vision, again, to be this contextual witness to the North Side. To pursue, to be agents of reconciliation. But research of multi-ethnic churches show, unfortunately, that they tend to perpetuate the very inequalities that they seek to dismantle. And unfortunately, there are times that we as Sanctuary do the same. And we can't dismiss that or ignore that when we prioritize the predilections of white congregants, then we no longer reflect a multi-ethnic church. Instead, we are prioritizing whiteness in that space. And so, again, while we have this beautiful vision of racial justice in the Bible, somehow, even at Sanctuary, we have watered it down to simply having a few friends who have a different skin color than us, or again, like Jenny said, that we go to Sanctuary, so that's good enough. But racial reconciliation, I think, isn't only a relationship, it's also a role. And so in white followership, which is something that I'm working on in my doctorate, I believe that it's really important for white people to understand their role in a multi-ethnic church, that we need to understand that as soon as we walk into a church like Sanctuary, our whiteness means something. It means power. Even if we don't think we have any, it can be a threat to the very vision of our church if we don't understand it. And so I'm hoping over the next few, hopefully in the soon future, to share more about what this actually tangibly looks like at Sanctuary. I know I've just kind of gave you the snapshot of it, But my hope is that as white Christians at Sanctuary, that we would understand how we could actually yield our power so that we could actually follow the leadership of our African American pastor that we love so much, so that we can, go toward the aim of justice, because following white normativity will not achieve that.
Well, yep. Yeah. Others, how do we shake off those shackles though, that are so at some points interwoven with the way we understand discipleship? Like Jenny talked about it, like good discipleship is a quiet time, a devotional, and that's essentially it. Like how do we move beyond that? What's the work of decentering whiteness in our theology and our worship in institutions, not just in churches, but in colleges and seminaries? Any thoughts on what that work looks like?
I keep coming back to this idea that we have to shift the currency of me over we, right? And think about where me ends and we begins. And I think about the work that I do every day around community development, and everyone can't come in and work in a nonprofit or a community development organization, and that's okay, because everyone has a role to play. And we talk about at the forum around this idea that this idea of readiness and really spending time with yourself and preparing yourself for being a part of something bigger than you are, and being prepared, right? So we talk about wholeness and how are you, what kind of capacity are you creating to do the best that you can do for community? We talk about how healthy you are mentally, physically, spiritually, to be able to withstand the ups and downs of community. We talk about how thorough you are, and that's how you prepare your capabilities to use the capacity you've already created. And then we talk about your willingness to be a part of something else besides yourself. And until you are those four things and at the best that you can be in those four things, we don't ask you to come into community to do work. We don't ask you to be the leader that you are. Everyone has a role to play, but there's a lot of people around that can then provide into the community. So the hope that I have for people is that they think about themselves as a part of the whole, and that they play that role and prepare themselves to be in community with each other. And that means that discipleship is being in solidarity, in this concept that these are two interchangeable words. They don't go separate from each other. And your discipleship isn't just this lone journey that you have, because you have a beautiful community at Sanctuary that is there to work with you. And you have a community that surrounds Sanctuary that doesn't ask you to serve them. They ask you to be a part of and to know your neighbors, right? And as we do that, are we being consistent? And if we're being consistent in our thoughts and our words and our actions, then we're actually doing the work that we're supposed to be doing as a community together. And that's what brings me hope, is that once we get that understanding, then we can put action to it. We'll be in a better place. We may not see it in our lifetimes, but our children's lifetimes. That's the hope I have.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Leah and Nadine, about what needs to be learned and unlearned as we think about discipleship, and how to raise up what I guess we might call just racial reconciliation warriors? I don't even know what we would call them, but in this work of discipleship, what needs to be learned and unlearned? How do we do it?
I think one of the things that's really important is giving up this binary that's been created between personal piety and justice. It's a false equivalency. It's not real. Kind of like the quiet times, the pure living kinds of ideas versus social justice being seen as kind of this radicalism, left love for other people. Like, the expression of my commitment to Jesus is made evident in part through how I live in community and how I love my neighbor. And so I think that the scrapping that binary is one part of that. I think the other part is going back to real basics and saying not just what were the teachings of Jesus, as in what were the red letters, but what was the teaching of Jesus in terms of how he did ministry? So who were the people who he engaged with? To lead like Jesus is to lead across difference. To be a follower of Jesus is to step into spaces where you may be uncomfortable, where you are encountering people who you may not have otherwise, is to love God and to love people, is to have quiet time and to be concerned about politics. Like how do we go back to learning from Jesus, not just from what he said, but from what he did? So I think those are some of the ways that some of the areas where we need to do some unlearning and relearning. And then I would say filling that gap from the book of Acts to where we are right now, and to understand some of these themes and threads that have shaped where we are right now, and understanding that theological racism is in part what gave us President Trump. And so how in the world did we go from Acts to Trump? We've got some reckoning to do in that time span.
That sounds like a great article for somebody to write. Yeah. Anything you would add, Nadine, before we jump into this last question?
I agree with everything that's been said. I think Jesus's model embodied relational righteousness or relational proximity. He got close to people who others wouldn't. And I feel like, as it's already been said, you can't just come to church and think that's good enough, or even just buy groceries at, across the street at Cub, and that's your due diligence. I think you have to be invested into the community if you truly desire to follow through the mission of Sanctuary. So yeah, I echo with everything that everybody's been saying.
Yeah. This is so good. I wish you could just see my insides, just like, this has been good for myself. So final question, and again, this is one that I'm going to ask the folks at home to respond to it in the comments in the chat there. I want to ask everybody here to respond to it as well. What hopeful vision do you have for the future, for the healing of our community, for the healing of our nation and our world? So what's the hope that you have? And then what's one thing that you're committed to doing, not just as an individual, but even helping to lead our church towards? Because I think I wholeheartedly agree that there's the individual action, but we're part of a movement. And so I'm asking us, like, what's the broader work that you are saying I'm committed to helping us to grow in this area or in this way? So what's your hopeful vision, and then what's the commitment you're making towards the movement? Pastor Rose, can I call on you first?
Sure, yeah. So my hopeful vision forward is really our Easter message this year, that hope is alive, that it's still alive, and that it is alive particularly in the person of Jesus, which means now it's alive in the body of Christ, that it's alive in us as the church, and we are an embodied extension of that. And so for me, my hope is that God is, well, I would say it this way, that I feel as though every day in this work, my prayer is that God would nourish hope in me, because it's so easy to become hopeless. And so for me, it is, I guess, that continual prayer that God would nourish this hope in all of us, and ignite something in us. And I guess for my now what, or my action is, I mean, for me, it's always the realization, or I'll say more recently, it's the realization that this work is never done. I mean, you all have heard me say so many times, preaching about lifelong faith, but justice is a lifelong journey as well. That there's never a time that we can graduate or finish from this work, especially as white people. And so I guess for me, it's the continual recommitment that this is the work that we're called to.
Yeah. What about you, Leah?
My hope is to do the work, to see, like, to do the work and understand that some of that is cerebral, but to see that acted out. I feel excited when I think about the possibilities of what Sanctuary could do and could be, in terms of being part of good news, of bringing good news to North Minneapolis, not assuming that there isn't already good news, but being part of God's work. And part of that for me is being hopeful for mobilization, selfishly for the benefit of my children, to raise Black sons, to have 3 Black sons, is to know that one day someone will see them and they will not be cute little boys in somebody's eyes. They will not be, those are Leah's babies. People won't see that label on their heads. And so my hope is to see change and to be part of the work for change for my children, for other people's children, but to also be part of that work so that my children are also empowered, motivated by a love for God and a belief in the good news and the power of the gospel to be able to enact work through the power of God. So that's my vision, is that we can move beyond just what's here and get to work.
Leah, one part of the work moving forward, there's a request from a member of our community, and I'm hearing it got a lot of likes in the chat section, that you would write a book called Whitewash Jesus.
We can talk after my dissertation is done.
just
if
like
only
we
only if Pastor Rose will co-write it with me.
Done.
Hey,
Black leadership, white followership, reorienting power in the multi-ethnic church. Let's do it.
So is that 1 book or 2?
2-part series, maybe.
Plenty of books.
Sanctuary series that's coming out.
Absolutely. And we get dibs on hosting the book, the release, and all of that. So just want to say that. Nadine, what's your hopeful vision, and what's your one thing?
My hopeful vision is just seeing a community that embodies restorative justice. And so we engage all parties that have been harmed, those who have experienced trauma, and that we collectively within this group seek healing. I think it's very imperative that we have the piece of confessing. And there's a lot of things that have happened in this nation that we have has been already stated many times, where we have been told to forget, or it's washed over as if it didn't happen. But when that acknowledgement happens, when people are given the space to lament, and then be restored to a wholeness, and we have that wholeness for the community as a whole, that's my hope. Because as Leah says, we're raising boys, and as one tries to come in, we're raising boys that I don't want to have to be afraid when they're not in my presence. I want them to be seen as someone else's brother too. I want my neighbors to see them as that's their neighbor, that's their brother, that's their somebody. And I think through that restorative wholeness and community mindset, I think that's how we can get to that vision. And through my work that I do In my professional life and personal life, I'm devoting myself to do that work.
Yeah, absolutely. Elder Jenny, what's your hopeful vision?
My hopeful vision is that Leah talked about this earlier. Lord's Prayer, our kingdom, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Jesus told us to pray that way. And so that as we work towards this, we are working in collaboration with the Holy Spirit. And that this is not just our attempts, but this is empowered by God, and to be able to strive forward with that vision and with that knowledge. Yeah. And part of my commitment is I serve on the neighboring team in addition to being on the elder board. And how are we good neighbors? How do we live this out? Because it's really clear that for numerous reasons that sanctuary is physically where we are at. There is a holy geography to why we are our location. And so how do we live that out in accordance with what Christ has called us to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What about you, Marcus? For sure.
Well, my vision, I live it every day. My vision is to create a community that's Black led and owned, so that we have all the parts and pieces of what a healthy community could be: spiritual, economic, educational, social, that is a beacon of how we're supposed to be as people together. Gosh, I mean, that vision just it expands into so many different ways, because it's not exclusionary of people that are not Black either. It's everyone that has to be a part of it. But I want to be in a world in which, you know, my community, I don't have to change anything for my community. I can be who I am every day. My son can be who he is. My daughters can be who they are. And they don't have to live with the anxiety that I've lived with, or people in my community have lived with for centuries. I want that healing, that restorative justice that Nadine talked about, where we go back to the harms and we correct it, and we move and heal together, so that we're no longer in the separate space where one is over the other. And I'm committed to do that every single day. Every day I wake up, that's my work, is figuring out how we can get this right once and for all, because we're in an extreme and extraordinary time right now. And we've all had 2 months at home to really reflect on what it is to be a citizen of this state, of this country, and this community. And I hope that we come out of it and not expect to go back to normal, but we create a new normal. And that new normal is inclusionary and restorative and hopeful amongst us all. So it's far-fetched, but I know we're going to get there eventually.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to take naps in that hopeful vision too.
Naps? Okay, there we go. Let's go with it.
Absolutely. When I think of my hopeful vision, when I go other places to talk about the work we're doing at Sanctuary and talk about reconciliation, I often tell people that I have a dream that someday my grandchildren will somehow come across one of my sermons or one of these talks and will honestly wonder, what was that crazy old man talking about? Like, we've so gone after the work of justice that we've moved the meter actually to the place where our future generations will wonder. They won't have the same context for the brokenness and the injustice that we do right now. And honestly, the two little beautiful girls that I'm raising at home every day are motivation. Like, I couldn't take the day off on this work if I wanted to, because I know they're going out into a world that, unless we do something about it, we'll see them as a threat, or as somehow disposable or less than, and see their bodies as somehow being owed to somebody else, that they won't have that agency that we've talked about. And so I'm creating a better world, hopefully for them and for future generations. And I love, I think Marcus mentioned it just now, that this idea of a collective well-being. Like if COVID-19 has not shown us anything, it has shown us that we're not as individualistic as we might want to be. Like our destinies are tied together. And as long as Black and brown people are devalued, we're, as a human race, we're less than we could be. And so I want to, a part of my vision and my hope is that white brothers and sisters, and not just white brothers and sisters, but any non-Black and brown folks would see it as not an issue for Black folks to figure out, but that all of us have to be committed to this work together, and that none of us are whole until all of us are whole. That's a part of my vision, and what I'm committed to doing in that work is to be more courageous in leading Sanctuary towards that work. It is easy to get caught up in the million other things that you could do in the life of a church and leave this conversation to the side. But honestly, if Sanctuary is not doing this work, I don't know if we're being Sanctuary in the way we were created to be from the beginning. And so just know that I'm recommitting myself tonight to just leading us courageously forward in this work. And I'm excited for all of you to play a part in that. You didn't say yes to that when you said yes to this conversation, but it was the fine print. You should have read the fine print. And I'm excited for the folks who are watching at home as well, because I know we probably could have we probably could have 4 or 5 other panels of people who are just as passionate about this, who bring as much skill and heart to this as well. And so I know that God is doing something in the life of our church, and I'm excited to move this work forward. Any final thoughts before I take a moment and pray for us as we wrap up this time? This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you all so much.
I just want to say thank you, Pastor Edrin, for leading this conversation and bringing us all together to share in this moment of everything, of community in your leadership, and Pastor Rose, you as well, as being the tag team here for our church. We really appreciate you both. So, yeah,
thank you all.
If I can say this, I'm not a pastor or a staff member or anything, but I would say, church, get ready, so that when our leadership asks that people step in for us to live into this work, that you're ready. Multiple strategies, one vision, however you play a role in the vision, the strategy, when they make the ask, be thinking about what role you can play and what you need to do to ready yourself. I will be doing the same. But that would be my call for the fellow congregants like myself. Get ready and be ready to respond. And nobody asked me to say that.
Hey, man, I'm glad you did, though. I'm glad you did. Yeah. Well, let's just take a moment and pray, because I do feel like this is a holy moment. So thank you all for being a part of it tonight. Let's pray. Lord God, thank you for this time. Thank you for allowing this conversation to take place, and for just visiting us by your Spirit. Lord, this does feel like holy ground, and I feel that you're the one bringing this to bear in this moment. And so I ask, Lord, that you would continue to guide us. I pray for my brothers and sisters on this call, for Pastor Rose, for Nadine, for Leah, for Marcus, for Elder Jenny. I thank you for them, for the journey that they are on and the work that you have been doing in their lives that brings them to this point. Thank you for allowing them to be a part of what you're doing in the life of our church and our community. And God, I ask that for every brother and sister watching at home, that this has also been a holy moment for them, that they've caught perhaps just a new vision for who we're called to be as a church and where we're headed as a church. And I ask, Lord, that you would just continue to go before us. Give us the reassurance that we need, Fill us with the courage and the hope that we need to do this work. And I pray that that we might always have a vision for your kingdom coming, your will being done in ways that would not make sense beyond it has to be God at work in this thing. And so I pray for the community of North Minneapolis that we call home. And I pray for all the other places around the Twin Cities where sanctuary people reside as well. And I ask that there would be small pockets of blessing popping up in all those places. God, I ask that our work would just continue to grow exponentially in this next season. And I ask, Lord, that you would help us to see what you're already doing, the doors that you've already opened, the opportunities that you've already set before us. Help us to see those things and help us to walk towards them with confidence. Lord, we love you, and we are so grateful that you first loved us. Thank you for being our God and allowing us to be your people. Mm-hmm. Be with us now and as we go our separate ways. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all so much again for being a part of this conversation. And it won't be the last time we do this, and know that this is the beginning of something special. So thank you for saying yes to it.
Thanks for creating this.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'm gonna sign us off, unless you've already done that, Tyler.